Hello and welcome to this, the first part in a series called Heritage and Hope, a history of the Presbyterian Church in Florida. This is largely based on a book by the same name, written by Dr. James Bullock, who retired pastor in Jacksonville, published some years ago. Now, Florida, of course, was discovered and first explored by Ponce de Leon. The Spanish were the first Europeans to arrive in Florida, at which point Christianity came with them in the form of Roman Catholicism. Now, Ponce de Leon, his expedition was in 1513, but did not result in any permanent settlements. He was followed by Hernando de Soto, who landed in the Tampa Bay area, and went up the coast all the way to the Mississippi River. Now, he died somewhere around the Mississippi River, but the rest of his expedition traveled from the Mississippi all the way through to Texas and down to Mexico. There was an attempt by Europeans to settle. This Tristan de Luna led a group trying to colonize in Florida in Pensacola Bay. That failed. A series of misfortunes made them abandon the settlement after 2 years. Now, the oldest city in our nation, continuous occupation, is St. Augustine, and there we found the Huguenot cemetery. Huguenots were, in fact, the first European settlers in Florida, not St. Augustine. The French missionaries settled around Fort Caroline, near present-day Jacksonville, in 1564. The following year, the Spanish arrived in St. Augustine. They drove out the French settlers and established the city of St. Augustine, the first permanent European settlement. Now, who were the Huguenots? The Huguenots were French Calvinists. They're kind of Presbyterians, except French instead of Scottish. Same type of theology, Reformed faith. Now, they in fact had the very first Thanksgiving feast in the Americas. In 1564, they had their clam chowder, alligator, and waterfowl from Florida. And in 1565, a year later, the Spanish arrived, and they have the massacre at Matanzas Inlet. Matanzas is the name for massacre in Spanish, and this is where the Spaniards drove them out, killing everyone except, I believe, women and children who fled into the woods. From that point on to the 1700s, in 1763, the Spanish had ruled it, but Britain gained it by treaty. Then, in 1783, Spain takes it back from Britain. And we don't have anybody really there except the Spanish until the time of the First Seminole Indian War. In the early 1800s, you start to see more Europeans come down. The First Seminole Indian War in 1818 preceded Florida becoming a U.S. territory. So why was the United States interested in Florida? Well, for one, Georgia was already one of the states, and there were a couple of things happening. The Seminole Indians of Florida did not respect the borders. They would go into Georgia on raiding parties and steal and plunder as they would. You also had the first shots fired in the Seminole Indian War were not against Seminole Indians. There was a establishment of runaway black slaves called Fort Negro, just south of the Georgia line. Andrew Jackson came through, and the first shot fired was one cannon into the powder magazine at Fort Negro. It blew the magazine, killing all 200 inhabitants of the fort. One shot, over in an instant. Now, the Spaniards received the ultimatum from the United States to control their Indian population and return runaway slaves, or if they could not do it, hand over the territory so the United States could do it. At that point, in 1821, the Spaniards realized that they were getting their gold and silver they were getting out of Mexico and South America were terrific, and Florida didn't have any of that, so they surrendered Florida to the United States. In 1835 to 42, you have the Second Seminole Indian War. That was settled by treaty. Then in 1845, Florida became a state, and in 1858, you have the Third Seminole Indian War. And this presentation will end at the beginning of the U.S. Civil War in 1861. So in that first Seminole Indian War, notable Presbyterians: Rachel Jackson, Andrew Jackson's wife. Andrew Jackson himself did not become a Presbyterian until after his term as president. He did not want to be seen as pandering to any specific religious group. You also had Colonel Robert Butler and Eliza Clinch, the wife of General Duncan Clinch. Okay. So, in 1820, you start seeing Presbyterians come down. The first Presbyterians went to the Ichi Valley around Pensacola. In 1821, they started a congregation in St. Augustine. And the very first minister went to St. Augustine, Eliza Lathrop. In 1824, the founding of the first actual church building, the St. Augustine Memorial Church, founded in, St. Augustine. Okay. So this is the present-day Memorial Church in St. Augustine. This is not the original building. Henry Flagler, the railroad tycoon, sponsored the construction of the building as it stands today. So what did Presbyterians talk about in 1820s? Well, they had some interesting questions. One on marriage. Can a black slave, a member of the church, sold by his master and taken away from his family, marry again? Curious question. It happened back then, but there was no actual answer on record how they settled that issue. They tried to get a missionary to go to Tallahassee and could not raise the funds or interest. And you have the Ichi Valley requested ordination for its minister and recognition by the Presbytery of Alabama. That church in Pensacola area had 112 members. You also have Presbyterians going to Quincy. In this one, built in 1924. In West Florida, you have a congregation in 1828. In 1828, another attempt was tried in Pensacola. They only had 2 Presbyterian families, and there was no enthusiasm to start a church there. But then you have the Indians. The Seminole Indians continued their raiding parties, which brought about the Second Seminole Indian War. And one of the things that the U.S. did was in 1830, they signed the Indian Removal Act. This was the beginning of the Trail of Tears. Seminole Indians, we know, they were put on trains and sent to Oklahoma. One of the things the Florida Cavalry did was to give them whiskey. When they were all drunk, they were much easier to put on the trains. Now, the treaty, though, was eventually signed after the end of the Second Seminole Indian War, and that has repercussions that we live with today. The Third Seminole Indian War did not end in a treaty. Now, the Florida State University has taken this unconquered logo, and it's really a misnomer. It's not quite that way. In reality, the Third Seminole Indian War ended with the near extinction of the Seminole Indians. They were hunted down, so there were only 100 or so left in the Everglades, and nobody could find a Seminole Indian to sign a treaty with. They were hunted almost to extinction. But if we look today at this map of Florida, you will see the area that's shaded in blue. The Second Seminole Indian War said that land belongs to the Seminole Indians, at which point the U.S. broke the treaty. Therefore, we would be hard-pressed if the Seminole Indians went to the UN and declared that this is their land by right. That includes Lakeland, it includes Ocala, it includes Orlando, and that is the reason that they're allowed to do gambling in the state of Florida and no one else is. In order for the state to put an end to gambling, they have to go to court. And if a court sees that the only lawful treaty says this is their land, they might wind up losing. And the state of Florida is not prepared to give those cities and this land back to the Seminole Indians. In the 1830s, we have some more churches being founded, this time in the Jacksonville area. Mandarin, known for the Mandarin orange. Mandarin oranges are not, in fact, from China. They're from a small town of orange groves outside of Jacksonville. Well, in 1834, they founded a church there. But in 1835, there was a deep freeze that killed all the orange trees, forcing a lot of people to move south. The church had its financial hardship, and with the occasional Indian attack, could no longer sustain a congregation. Ultimately, they died out, and no church was found in Mandarin again until 1961. In 1938, a church was found in Jacksonville. A ship captain, Obadiah Conger, meets in Jacksonville. Jacksonville at the time had a population of less than 600 people. In 1842, you have the two events. The Presbytery of Florida is officially recognized. Also, in 1842, you have the Armed Occupation Act. The United States gave away 10 acres of land to every man with a gun who would go and inhabit the land. So there was a rush of settlers to come down to Florida, take land, and protect it. Well, with a rush of people, you have a revival. In 1843, there was one in Tallahassee. And it says here that large crowds prayed daily and listened to sermons in the evening for 10 days, followed by a week of enthusiasm, resulting in 19 converts. Backsliders were reclaimed, God's people quickened and animated, hard hearts softened, and stupid sinners awakened. That was so successful, they moved down the road to Quincy just a year later. They tried again. This time, not such successful. The quote here is, "There is no Holy Ghost here, brethren." But in that year, they did have a church there, and the session of the church condemned dancing in amusement halls, social parties, and even in one's home. 1843, a Reverend Edmund Lee in Manatee County. Manatee, of course, south of Tampa Bay area, where you have a church with 16 members. But Reverend Lee also spoke to slaves. He routinely conducted services for about 151 slaves of Mr. Robert Gamble. Now, Ichi Valley in Walton County, largest church in the state in the 1840s, 174 members. And they formed a school to serve over 300 students. Now you also have in the Tampa Bay area in the late 1840s, Henry Axtell starting at Fort Brooke. But the hurricane hit in 48, wiping out the chapel. And in 1850, the Indian threat was over. The Third Seminole Indian War was concluded, and who haven't been moved out to Oklahoma were no longer a threat. So the U.S. Army no longer needed to maintain a fort in that location. Ultimately, that church did not survive. So we move up to 1850. Almost 90,000 residents in Florida. 26 of the 177 churches, Presbyterian, almost 10%. Our property values, less than $32,000. We had 10 congregations, 624 members, and seating for 6,000. Less than 10% of our seats were full. There was optimism. So what was it like to celebrate Christmas in Jacksonville? Well, as there's a quote on here that, let's see. What was known for? Alarming spiritual desolation. The church congregations were doubling, membership up by a third, but the lament was there was poor Sabbath attendance. Dr. Joseph Mitchell reported a slave auction of 300 slaves, and he was concerned about their souls. Now, the church attendance at Christmas was poor due to heavy drinking, horse racing, fighting, and lying drunk in the gutters. Jacksonville was a frontier town. But in the short 10 years later, we're seeing Florida's population, almost 80,000, Presbyterians growing, up from 10 churches to 23, 17 members, and 17 ministers, and another couple hundred members. Also, in 1860, you'll find that the church had its highest percentage of black membership. We have not reached 10% of our membership being black since the Civil War. Our seats, we had 10 seats per member. Property values soared up from 32,000 to 50. Now, some of the old churches still exist, and you'll see that the church architecture includes balconies. Now, other churches had balconies too, but these balconies were specifically built for slaves. This was so that the most church members, the European church members, would sit below, and their slaves would sit in the balcony, so that they would hear the same sermons preached, hear the same music, and, well, maintain their separation. Slavery was a blight on Florida, but Presbyterians were not against it, not uniformly. Some Presbyterian ministers did own slaves, and there were some abolitionists in the Presbyterian Church as well. It was not to 100% either way, but Florida leaned very much with its state. Among the things said in sermons, this proclamation by the Presbytery of Georgia: abolitionists are in entire opposition to both the letter and spirit of the gospel. Incendiaries, the enemies of our country, the disturbers of the peace, our churches, the destroyers of our families, and all that we hold most dear. Florida, they seconded this amendment from the Presbytery of Georgia. They agreed with it, but they did reiterate that slaves should also receive religious instruction. Well, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. All right.